everyone, here is how I constructed this Valentine's Day dress for Audrey using the Children's Corner pattern Victoria. As always, all the materials as well as timestamps are linked down below. So to get started, I cut out the front and back pattern pieces. For the front, I have 2 cut on the fold, 1 cut out of my garment fabric and another cut out of my lining. And then for the back, I have 2 cut out of my garment fabric and 2 cut out of my lining. And when it comes to that back, I cut the garment fabric along the lines for the buttons, whereas I cut along the center back line for the lining. You could cut both along the button line if you wish, but since I'm using a different fabric for my lining, I want it to turn the corner, and I will explain more on that in a little bit. And for those darts, I marked the bottom of the darts with little clips. I also cut 2 sleeves and then 4 collars. Finally, I cut 2 sash ties, and then 1 big rectangle for the skirt. I didn't use the pattern for the skirt Audrey loves and basically demands extremely full skirts these days, so I'm going to use 2 selvage to selvage pieces for the skirt. Okay, so to get it started, I sew all of those darts. To do the darts, I put a pin at the top of the dart and then carefully pull that through my pattern. It'll leave a little hole, and that is just fine with me. I use this pin and the clips at the bottom of the dart to align everything. Once it's aligned, I give it an ironing and sew it all down in place. I like to do darts starting at the bottom and kind of angling towards that pin. So once I'm done with all those darts, then I embellish the front of my bodice. I have another video going over how I did this little motif, and if I had done a hand embroidered design, I would have done that before cutting out my pattern piece. When I was done doing that little heart, then I joined the bodice front to the bodice back at the shoulder seams. I'm just doing regular seams here, and I repeat the same thing for the lining, and I iron all of those seams open. Then I join the garment back to the lining back. Once I have both of those backs joined together, then I ironed that seam open. And because I cut the lining back a little bit shorter than the garment back, this will cause that garment back to come around that, around that center back, around that curve, and there's no chance of seeing the lining when the garment is being worn. It's pretty slick, huh? And before sewing the neckline, I construct those collar pieces. Of course, doing the collar is optional, but I'm taking that option with this little dress. So I attached piping to the collar. The seam allowance for doing the collar is 1/4 inch, so I trimmed the piping down to 1/4 inch. And this just helps, keep that seam allowance constant, but it also helps the piping to turn the curves of the collar better. And I changed my foot to a zipper foot. It works just fine, and I do not have a piping foot for this machine just yet. So I sew the piping to the collar, and I try to sew a 1/16 of an inch or so away from the stitches on the piping, and then I trim up that seam. I put that piece of the collar right side together with the other piece of the collar and sew them with the previous stitches facing up. And I try to sew that 1/16 of an inch inside those stitches, and that just makes for a very clean transition. And so once I'm done sewing, I trim up that seam. I turn the collars right sides out and I give them an ironing, and then I join them together at the front. Basically, I'm just basting them with a large zigzag, and this is going to ensure that the collars will be sewn to the neckline without any gaps. A gap between these collars is not the worst thing in the world, but it does make your work look a little bit sloppy. So basting, this basting and zigzag is just an easy way to avoid that gap. Then I join the collars to the neckline of the dress. I pin the collar in place first, starting with pinning the center front of the collar to the center front of the bodice. And I sew the collar to the garment of the dress, and then I flip that lining over, matching up the shoulder seams and pinning them in place. And again, that back of the dress is going to wrap around the center back and go onto the lining side, onto the inside of the dress. And as far as that back seam is concerned, I'm having the seam face towards the lining, if that makes sense. Then I sew the neckline together, having those previous stitches facing up so I can sew right on top of them. And once I was done with those stitches, I trimmed up the seam and put a bunch of little clips around those curves. Basically, if there's any pulling, kind of puckering on that neckline, you'll need to put more clips in that area of the curve to release the fabric and allow it to lay nice and flat. I'll use this little pointer tool. It is linked down below to press out all of those corners into a nice neat point. When I had my bodice all together, I looked at the colors and thought I really should have gone with red piping, but unfortunately Farmhouse Fabrics is not in my backyard, despite of my begging. So I digress. Instead, I took one strand of DMC embroidery floss and I used that to do a running stitch around the collar. To tie it on and off, I just snuck my needle in between the collar pieces and made a little loop, and I went through that loop just once. And then I did my stitching, that little running stitch, and I repeated the same process to tie off. And voila, I got me some red on that collar. And I'm really kind of happy about this accident, since I wouldn't have thought to do this if I had the red piping on hand. But I really like how the collar turned out. It feels very vintage and sweet. So then I moved on to the sleeve, and I have clip marks at the bottom of the sleeve to mark where those dots are, as well as the top of the sleeve marking the front and back of the sleeve. I have one clip mark at the front of the sleeve and 2 clips at the back of the sleeve. I took some of this pink sateen and cut it into 2-inch wide bias bands, although really I should have done 4-inch wide. I am going to chalk that up to a tired mama moment, and I will explain why in a second. So I folded the bands in half and ironed them together. The right side of the fabric is facing out and the raw edges are together. I'm thinking the sleeve would look darling with some piping and then this little pink bias band. So first I sew the piping onto the edge of the sleeve, and then I sew the bias band, being careful to follow the previous stitches securing the piping on. And then here's my little sleeve assembly after the piping and bias band are attached, and I really like the proportions, but I also really like to flip the bias band around that raw edge and hand sew the folded part of the bias band into those machine stitches. And I've done that in a bunch of my other videos, but as you can see, it's not quite wide enough to do that in this case. I should have done a 4-inch wide bias band, so I'm just going to skip that route this time. And again, I'm chalking it up to a tired mama moment. Instead, I'm trimming that seam down and then zigzagging over top, and I'm moving on with life. So I put 2 rows of gather stitches at the top of the sleeve in between those marks, marking the front and back of the sleeve. Then I gather up the sleeve, and since I'm doing an inserted sleeve for this dress, I just sew up the sleeve ends together, and then I set that sleeve aside for now. Then I grab the skirt fabric. Like I was saying earlier, Audrey likes a big skirt. So I'm going to use 2 pieces of fabric each from the selvage edge to the selvage edge. So next I put a placket in the center back of the skirt, and I have a video going over 2 different methods of plackets. I like them both. It just kind of depends on the product that I'm working on and my mood at the time. So I join one side seam together using a French seam. It doesn't matter which side, just pick one and go with it. And then I grabbed this pink sateen again and ripped it to 6.5 inches wide. I'm going to use this to hem the bottom of the dress. I sewed 2 pieces together so it's long enough to cover the entire width of the skirt, and then I am sewing it a little bit away from the selvage edge since I'm going to be cutting off that little bit. And then I give that seam an ironing. From there, I use the other side of that smocking blocking board, it's linked down below, to make a little curved hem design. I make a higher area of 3 curves, and that's going to be in the center front, and then I keep the rest of the curves the same around the dress. But this is entirely up to you. You can just take this and run with it. And I am using a friction heat activated pen and a light board, and yes, both are linked down below. And whatever design you end up doing, be mindful how the design will come together on that other side seam. For example, I stopped at the last full curve on each end, and then I gave about 1/2 inch of seam allowance so those points would come together and would not interrupt the pattern. It would just keep flowing. Then I pinned the pink curve fabric to the ivory. I'm pinning the right side of the pink fabric to the wrong side of the ivory fabric. This way the pink fabric will turn around to the right side of the ivory fabric and finish off the bottom of the hem in the process. So I sew the 2 together along the bottom. Then I carefully give that seam an ironing, being cautious to keep my iron away from those friction heat curved marks, since it will erase them. Next, I understitch that bottom hem seam. This will stop the ivory fabric from peeking below the pink fabric. It also helps make a really nice clean line on that seam. So then I iron the pink fabric on the right side of the ivory fabric, again being careful not to iron over those friction curved marks. And I pin all of that in place, and then I use this wash away thread to stitch around the curves with a straight stitch. I'm basically using using this thread to baste the curves in place, and it will dissolve away with water. So then I carefully cut around the curves. Just take your time. I did this underneath a sleeping baby on the couch. It took about 15 minutes. Remember, the turtle wins the race. Finally, I gave that an ironing, and then I wanted to put a pin stitch at the top of the curve, but my machine has been on its last leg, y'all, and I did not want to do this stitch. Can you say a hot mess? I was very frustrated. So instead, I changed my thread to a pink color, and I did a zigzag over top, and I am just going to move on with life. So next, I trimmed off the excess on the skirt ends. So remember, I stopped that curve pattern at the last full curve, so that gave a few inches on either side of the skirt of like extra, if you will. The skirt is about 90 inches wide, so taking off, say 6 inches or so is not going to change the overall look of the dress, aka I am not sweating it. I cut about a ½ inch on the outside of the last curve on the each end, and then I ripped the skirt the rest of the way. Ripping is just an easy way, and it's very accurate way to cut your thread. From there, I joined the side seam with a French seam, and voila, my skirt is all sewn together, and you can see how those curves come together nicely to continue that pattern. Alright, to attach the skirt to the dress, I put 2 rows of gather stitches all the way around. Alternatively, you could have done some sort of pleat around the skirt. I'm going with gather stitches. So I grabbed my bodice and I sewed up the side seams. I'm sewing the dress side seam using a regular seam, and I'm keeping that separate from the lining, so you'll have 4 side seams total to do. 2 off, for the garment fabric, as well as 2 for the lining fabric. I hope that makes sense. I ironed those seams open, and then I installed the sleeves. I attached the sleeves by matching the bottom sleeve of the sleeve to the side seam of the dress. Then I sew around to attach the sleeve. I'll cover that seam by the lining. And this is something I learned in a couture book for Chanel. Apparently they fold over the lining and hand sew that over the sleeve seam. Now if you do this, the top of your puffy sleeve will go from this to this. And as you can see, it's still puffy, but it's not as big. And this is what the inside of those sleeves look all nice and finished. Finally, I'm attaching those side ties. So I put the tie on itself, right sides together, and I sew the tie down the length and then over that little angle bit. I'm trimming up that seam, making sure to trim up the points on the little angle bit, and then I turn the tie right sides out. And I use my scissors to push those corners of the ends of the ties. It just makes the point come out nicely. And I forgot about these ties when putting together my bodice, so I took my trusty seam ripper and opened up, a little bit of those side seams so I could slide the tie into that seam. Before doing this, I ran 2 rows of gather stitches on the ends of the ties and gathered up those so they will fit well in the seam. And then I sewed that seam back down, and again, talking it up to a tired mama moment. I'm surprised I'm not making more mistakes with being newly postpartum, and that is perfectly alright. I am 1 month out with Daisy, and I have 3 and under, so I'm giving myself some grace. So finally, I attached the gathered skirt to the bodice of the dress. I'm only attaching it to the garment fabric. I'm leaving that lining out of the seam, and I'm attaching the skirt from where the fold is at the back of the bodice to where the other fold is at the other back of the bodice. And I pin those spots in place, and then I pinned the center front of the skirt to the center front of the bodice, and finally I pin each of those side seams in place, the side seam of the skirt to the side seam of the bodice. And then from there, I just adjust the gathers so they are evenly distributed. And I sew that seam in place. And I know this was a long one. My voice is a little bit rough now. I need to get some water, and I'm trying to be very quiet because Daisy is sleeping on me. So there were lots of pieces to the dress, but just take things one step at a time and it will all come together. Even with a baby, it is possible. Trust me, I know it can be frustrating, but it's possible, one thing at a time. So I did my hand finishing work, and here you go. Here is the inside of the dress, in case you were just curious on how it came out with the lining and everything on those sleeves. I hope this video was helpful. If y'all have any questions, please leave them in the comments down below, and I will do my best to answer them. And as always, I appreciate y'all for watching, and I hope to catch y'all next time.